The Outsider's Summary, a teen brotherhood tested by class and violence. The Outsider's Summary covers S.E. Hinton's 1967 novel about two teenage worlds living in the same town but treating each other like enemies. The story follows Ponyboy Curtis, a greaser who wants a life bigger than street reputation, but keeps getting pulled back into fights that feel older than him. Hinton writes with directness and speed, so every choice lands like a shove. You either hit back or you get hurt. The central tension is not simply greasers versus SOCs. It is whether a kid can keep a self when the neighborhood keeps handing him a role. Ponyboy is surrounded by boys who act tough because toughness is what they can afford. Across town are boys who act careless because consequences rarely touch them. The novel matters because it shows how violence becomes a language when people do not believe anyone will listen to their words. It also shows how fast that language collapses and what it costs when it does. The story turns on whether Ponyboy can hold on to his humanity while the world tries to turn him into a stereotype. Key points. The Outsiders is a coming-of-age novel where teenage identity is shaped by class, loyalty, and fear. Ponyboy Curtis is a sensitive greaser who loves books, but lives inside a culture that rewards hardness. A single night of escalating tension forces Ponyboy and Johnny to make choices that cannot be taken back. The greaser's loyalty is real, but it also traps them in cycles of pride, retaliation, and grief. Hinton treats the SOCs as more than villains, showing how privilege can still breed emptiness and cruelty. The story argues that empathy is not a soft option, it is a survival skill. Stay Gold becomes the book's emotional thesis. Protect what is good before the world teaches you to destroy it. Full plot. Here is the full plot summary with spoilers. The Outsiders follows Ponyboy Curtis, a bookish 14-year-old greaser who wants to keep his future open, as he navigates life with his brothers and his gang in a town split by money and status. The greasers are poor kids who wear their identity like armor. The SOCs are wealthy kids who treat the town like a playground. Ponyboy can feel the divide in every small interaction, but the story shows how quickly divide turns into blood. Act 1, Setup and Inciting Incident. Ponyboy lives with Derry Curtis, his oldest brother and guardian, who wants to keep the family together, and Soda Pop Curtis, his older brother who wants everyone to stop fighting and just be happy. Their parents have died, and the house runs on a fragile truce. Derry works himself into exhaustion. Soda Pop keeps the peace with charm, and Ponyboy tries to stay out of trouble by being smart. But trouble is not only something Ponyboy chooses. Trouble is something the neighborhood delivers. Ponyboy also belongs to a group of greasers who function like a substitute family. Johnny Cade, a quiet 16-year-old who wants safety more than respect, is the most vulnerable among them, shaped by an abusive home and earlier violence from the SOCs. Dallas Winston, called Dally, a hardened 17-year-old who wants to feel nothing because feeling is a weakness, is dangerous even to his friends. 2-Bit Matthews, the older jokester who wants life to stay light, masks seriousness with humor. Steve Randall, Soda Pop's best friend who wants to look tough and in control, treats caring like an embarrassment. One night, Ponyboy leaves a movie theater alone and gets jumped by Socs. The attack is fast and humiliating, and it makes the class divide personal. The gang arrives in time to rescue Ponyboy, and the message is clear. Walking alone is an invitation to be hurt. Ponyboy is relieved, but he is also shaken by how normal this is for everyone else. Soon after, Ponyboy and Johnny go to a drive-in theater and meet Cherry Valance, a sock girl who wants to be seen as a person, not a label, and Marcia, Cherry's friend who wants a fun night without drama. Ponyboy talks easily with Cherry, surprising himself. For a moment, conversation becomes a bridge between worlds. Then Dally shows up and behaves aggressively toward the girls, and Johnny and Ponyboy push him away. The scene reveals something important. The greasers are not one thing. Ponyboy and Johnny want decency, while Dally is wired for cruelty, and that difference is going to matter. When the girls' boyfriends arrive, Bob Sheldon, a sock who wants dominance and is used to getting it, and Randy Adderson, a sock who wants to avoid serious consequences, confront the greasers. 2-Bit flashes a switchblade. The moment threatens to become a fight, and Cherry chooses the safest exit. Cherry and Marcia leave with Bob and Randy to keep the night from turning into a brawl. Ponyboy watches them go, and learns a hard rule: in a divided town, Even kindness gets policed by status. Ponyboy returns home late. Derry is frightened, and that fear comes out as anger. Derry hits Ponyboy, and Ponyboy feels betrayed in the place that should be safest. Ponyboy runs, not because he has a plan, but because his shame is louder than his logic. Ponyboy finds Johnny in a park, and the two sit with the kind of exhausted quiet that comes from being too young to carry the weight they are carrying. Then the Socs arrive again. Bob and his friends are drunk and looking for control. The confrontation escalates with ugly speed. Ponyboy is shoved and held down, and the attack turns into something that feels like an attempted killing. Johnny, cornered and terrified, makes a decision in a single beat. Johnny stabs Bob to save Ponyboy. Bob dies, and both boys immediately understand what that means. This is no longer a rumble or a scare. This is murder, even if it was done in panic and self-defense. Ponyboy and Johnny do not go to the police. They go to the one person they think can handle a crisis without blinking. They find Dally, and Dally responds like someone who has prepared for this kind of moment his whole life. Dally gives Ponyboy and Johnny money, a gun, and instructions. Dally sends them to an abandoned church in a small town called Windrixville, telling them to hide until Dally can figure out what comes next. Ponyboy and Johnny board a train and disappear into a quiet place that does not match the chaos behind them. The church becomes a temporary refuge, but it also becomes a pressure cooker. The boys are trapped with their thoughts, their fear, and the knowledge that they cannot go home without consequences. What changes here is that the conflict stops being about gangs and becomes about survival. Act 2. Escalation and midpoint shift. In Windrixville, Ponyboy and Johnny try to transform themselves into people the world will not recognize. They cut and bleach their hair. They buy simple clothes. Ponyboy watches his reflection change and feels an eerie distance from his own identity. The disguise is practical, but it also carries a message. If the world hates what you are, you learn to edit yourself. The days in the church force Ponyboy and Johnny into an unusual kind of intimacy. They read, talk, and watch the sky. Ponyboy recites Robert Frost's poem, "Nothing Gold Can Stay," and Johnny latches on to the idea with desperation. For Johnny, gold is the brief period before life teaches you that pain is permanent. Ponyboy tries to treat the poem like literature, but Johnny treats it like a lifeline. Dally visits with news. The police are looking for the boys, and the gang back home is under strain. Cherry, despite being a sock, has become an important source of information for the greasers, partly out of guilt and partly out of a genuine recognition that things have gone too far. A big rumble is being planned. A greaser versus SOC fight, meant to settle pride with fists. Dally tells Ponyboy and Johnny that the situation is heating up, and the boys realize hiding will not end anything. It is only delaying the collision. Ponyboy and Johnny decide to return and turn themselves in, hoping to face the consequences with some dignity. On the way, they stop near the church and see smoke. The abandoned building is on fire, and a group of school children are trapped inside. The boys have seconds to choose. They can keep running, protect themselves, and stay invisible. Or they can go in and become visible in the most dangerous way possible. Ponyboy runs into the church. Johnny follows. They break windows, guide children out, and move with a clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. The rescue works, but the building collapses in the middle of it. Ponyboy is knocked unconscious, and Johnny is badly injured. Dally, arriving at the scene, helps pull Ponyboy out, and is injured as well. When Ponyboy wakes up, the newspapers and adults call the boys heroes, and Ponyboy experiences a sharp irony. The same town that would call him trash can also call him brave, depending on the headline. The injuries create a new problem. Johnny is not just hiding from the law anymore. Johnny is fighting for his life. Ponyboy is concussed and disoriented. Dally is hurt, but his pain shows up as rage. The church fire shifts the story from a moral question about guilt into a medical countdown, and everything that follows is shaped by time. Ponyboy is taken to a hospital where the adults finally enter the story in an unavoidable way. Derry and Soda Pop arrive, panicked and relieved, and Ponyboy sees how much Derry's strictness has been fear disguised as control. Derry thought he had to be hard to keep Ponyboy alive. Ponyboy thought Derry's hardness meant a lack of love. The hospital becomes a place where the family's misunderstanding is forced into the open, because there is no room left for performance. Johnny is in critical condition. Johnny's mother shows up and treats Johnny like a disappointment rather than a son, proving that Johnny's home really was a place of emotional starvation. The gang rallies around Johnny, and Ponyboy begins to see how loyalty can be both beautiful and limiting. The Greasers love each other, but they also accept suffering as normal. At the same time, Ponyboy has a brief but important conversation with Randy Adderson. Randy tells Ponyboy that Bob had problems too, that Bob lived under pressure and had become cruel as a result. Randy does not excuse Bob's violence, but Randy's honesty complicates Ponyboy's need to see the world in clean categories. The conversation lands because it is not sentimental. Randy is tired. Ponyboy is tired. Both boys can see the pattern and feel how hard it is to step out of it. The rumble approaches. For Derry and the older Greasers, the fight has become a matter of pride and territory. For Ponyboy, the rumble feels smaller now, almost childish compared to the hospital room where Johnny lies. Ponyboy still gets pulled into it, because in this world refusing to fight has consequences too. The boys go to the rumble, and the violence is messy and intimate. Derry fights with the intensity of someone who has been carrying responsibility for too long. Dally shows up despite injuries, driven by pure refusal to be left out. The Greasers win. The SOCs run first, and the Greasers take that as proof that they have earned something. But the victory feels hollow, because Ponyboy's mind is already back with Johnny. The fight does not solve the deeper issue. It only drains it for a moment. After the rumble, Dally takes Ponyboy to the hospital. Ponyboy wants to believe he is arriving in time for hope. Ponyboy walks into a room where the outcome is already decided. What changes here is that the story's danger shifts from being caught to being broken. Act 3. Climax and Resolution. Ponyboy and Dally reach Johnny's hospital room. Johnny is weak and in pain, but Johnny's attention is sharp. Johnny does not talk like someone trying to be heroic. Johnny talks like someone who finally understands what matters. Johnny tells Ponyboy to stay gold, urging Ponyboy to hold on to the part of himself that still notices sunsets and poetry. Johnny's message is not naive. It is desperate and clear-eyed. Johnny is saying that if Ponyboy becomes numb, then the violence has won, even if Ponyboy survives it. Johnny dies. Ponyboy feels his mind reject the fact, because accepting it would mean accepting a world where doing the right thing can still destroy you. Dally, who has built his identity on being unbreakable, cannot handle the loss. Johnny was the one person Dally protected without irony. Johnny's death turns Dally's toughness into an exposed nerve. Dally leaves the hospital in a storm. Ponyboy follows, and Ponyboy watches Dally unravel in public. Dally's grief does not look like tears. It looks like reckless action. Dally robs a store, draws the police into a chase, and ends up in an empty lot. When Ponyboy arrives, Dally is holding a gun and daring the world to finish what it has started. The gun is unloaded, but the gesture is loaded. Dally lifts it anyway, and the police shoot Dally. Dally dies in a posture that looks like defiance, but reads like surrender. The double loss hits Ponyboy like physical impact. Ponyboy collapses, is taken away, and enters a period of shock. At home, Ponyboy's reality becomes unstable. Ponyboy struggles with memory, school, and anger. Ponyboy starts telling himself that Johnny was not a hero, that Johnny did not mean anything, because meaning would require grief. Ponyboy also becomes more volatile, and it scares Soda Pop and Derry because they can see Ponyboy slipping into the very hardness Ponyboy once criticized. The legal consequences catch up too. There is a hearing related to Bob's death, and Ponyboy's testimony matters. Ponyboy wants the court to see the truth, but Ponyboy is also frightened of being blamed. Ponyboy's injuries and disorientation make the process more confusing. Cherry plays a role by telling the truth about the night Bob died, and Ponyboy understands that Cherry's loyalty is complicated. Cherry cared about Bob, but Cherry also recognizes that Bob crossed lines that cannot be defended. After the hearing, Ponyboy has to live with the aftertaste of everything that happened. The gang is still there, but the gang's jokes and swagger no longer block the reality that kids died. Ponyboy and 2-Bit have a moment where a switchblade becomes a symbol of how easily violence sits in their hands. Ponyboy catches himself moving toward danger out of habit, and that habit scares him more than the SOCs ever did. The real resolution comes quietly, through writing. Ponyboy's English teacher, Mr. Syme, a teacher who wants Ponyboy to apply himself before it is too late, assigns Ponyboy a personal theme essay. Ponyboy realizes he has been carrying a story that needs to be told, not to entertain, but to warn. Ponyboy decides to write about what happened, starting from a simple moment leaving a movie theater because that is where his life split open. The act of telling becomes Ponyboy's way of choosing meaning over numbness. The novel ends by circling back to its opening line, revealing that what the reader has experienced is Ponyboy's written account. The loop is not a trick. It is an argument. Stories can be a bridge between worlds, and telling the truth can be a form of survival. Analysis and themes. Theme 1. Class as a cage. Claim. The book argues that class is not just money, but a daily system that decides whose pain counts. Evidence. Ponyboy is jumped for walking home, while sock boys treat violence like a thrill with a safety net. Derry's abandoned college path shows how responsibility can kill opportunity. The rumble becomes a ritual where both sides try to prove worth with bruises. So what? When people believe the world is already stacked, they start acting as if nothing they do will change it. That belief produces anger, pride, and fatalism. The novel shows how quickly class becomes identity, and how identity becomes destiny unless someone interrupts the pattern. Theme 2. Violence as identity. Claim. Hinton shows violence becoming a social language when respect feels scarce. Evidence. The greasers are expected to fight, because backing down invites more attacks. The SOCs are expected to dominate because their world rewards cruelty as confidence. The rumble is framed as settling something, but it only deepens the need for another fight later. So what? Violence is often less about hatred than about belonging. People hit to prove membership in a group that promises protection. The novel makes a bleak point. When communities do not offer safe ways to earn status, young people invent dangerous ones. Theme 3. Innocence and stay gold. Claim. The story treats innocence as a fragile strength, not a childish weakness. Evidence. Ponyboy's love of books, sunsets, and poetry becomes a contrast to the town's harsh scripts. Johnny's attachment to nothing gold can stay is a clear signal that Johnny is trying to name what keeps disappearing. Johnny's final message to Ponyboy turns stay gold into a moral instruction under pressure. So what? In hard environments, sensitivity becomes a liability unless it is protected. The novel argues that staying human requires active effort. It is not nostalgia. It is a decision to resist becoming numb, even when numbness looks like the easiest way to survive. Theme 4. Empathy as rebellion. Claim. The book suggests empathy is the only real way out of the cycle. Evidence. Ponyboy's conversations with Cherry and Randy break the illusion that the other side is a different species. The church rescue forces Ponyboy and Johnny into a public act that contradicts the town's stereotypes. Ponyboy's final choice to write the story is an attempt to reach readers who might otherwise repeat the same mistakes. So what? Empathy disrupts simplistic stories that justify cruelty. It is harder than hate because it requires attention and humility. The novel presents empathy as a form of rebellion against social sorting because it refuses to let labels do the thinking. Character arcs. Protagonist. Ponyboy begins with a belief that the world is divided into clear sides, and that survival means sticking to his own. Ponyboy ends with a belief that labels are traps, and that survival requires telling the truth, even when the truth hurts. The shift is forced by a chain of events that makes the game real: the park violence, the hiding, the church fire, the hospital losses, and finally the recognition that silence will only create more casualties. A key secondary arc belongs to Derry. Derry starts as a stern authority figure in Ponyboy's eyes, but is revealed as a frightened young man carrying adult responsibility. Derry's love is consistent, but his methods are flawed, and the story pushes him toward openness rather than control. Structure. The novel's power comes from its compression. Hinton wastes almost nothing. Events move quickly, but they do not feel random because each escalation grows from the last. Small humiliations become big decisions. One late night becomes a life split into before and after. First-person narration matters too. Ponyboy's voice keeps the story grounded in lived detail instead of social commentary. Because Ponyboy notices poetry in the sky, the reader feels the cost when the story tries to crush those instincts. The ending's loop back to the opening line turns the entire book into an act of processing trauma, not just recounting it. Symbolism is handled with restraint. The sunset becomes a shared human experience across class lines. Hair becomes identity, disguise, and loss. Gold becomes the name for something precious that does not survive unless someone protects it. What most summaries miss. Many summaries treat the outsiders as a clean moral about violence is bad or be nice to each other. The book is sharper than that. It shows why violence feels rational to teenagers who believe the future has already been taken from them. The boys are not fighting because they love pain. They are fighting because they do not see alternatives that will keep them safe and respected. Another overlooked element is how the story judges toughness. It does not simply praise softness and condemn hardness. It shows toughness as a tool that sometimes keeps you alive and sometimes destroys you from the inside. Dally is not a villain inserted to make a point. Dally is a case study in what happens when a person decides feeling is too dangerous, then meets a loss that breaks through anyway. Finally, the book's ending is not just a neat narrative trick. It is Ponyboy choosing authorship over reaction. The deepest conflict is not SOCs versus greasers. It is whether Ponyboy will become someone who repeats the cycle, or someone who names it clearly enough to interrupt it. Relevance today. The novel's class divide maps easily onto modern inequality, but it also speaks to how social identity hardens online. Teenagers still get sorted into visible categories, judged fast, and punished for stepping out of assigned roles. The speed of today's social media makes that sorting more public and more permanent. The Outsiders also feels current in how it shows masculinity as performance. Many boys still learn that vulnerability invites ridicule, while aggression earns respect. The story makes clear how that lesson produces emotional illiteracy, which then produces violence, broken friendships, and self-destruction. The book's rumble logic shows up in modern culture wars and school conflicts, where group belonging becomes more important than truth. People choose sides first, then reinterpret every event to fit the side. The novel suggests that side-taking can become addictive because it replaces uncertainty with identity. Technology adds a new layer. If Ponyboy's world had phones and cameras everywhere, the violence would be recorded, shared, and argued over in real time. That could create accountability, but it could also create spectacle. The book's warning still holds. When pain becomes entertainment, empathy collapses. Work and culture parallels are there too. Derry's sacrifice for the family mirrors young adults who drop education or goals to cover rent, care duties, or emergencies. The stress of being responsible too early remains a quiet crisis, especially in households where safety nets are thin. The novel also speaks to relationships and identity. Ponyboy's strongest moments come from refusing the script, talking honestly with Cherry, listening to Randy, choosing writing instead of retaliation. The message is not be perfect. It is do not let the world turn you into the worst version of yourself. And in politics and power, the story captures a familiar pattern. Groups with privilege can treat conflict as play, while groups without it experience the same conflict as survival. The result is misunderstanding, escalation, and then tragedy that everyone claims they did not want. Ending explained. The ending closes the external conflict through loss and aftermath, but it resolves the deeper question through Ponyboy's decision to write. Ponyboy cannot undo what happened, and the book refuses to offer a clean comfort that would cheapen the damage. Instead, it shows Ponyboy finding a way to turn experience into meaning. The ending means Ponyboy is choosing consciousness over numbness, and connection over the violent loyalty that keeps boys trapped. The final turn, where the story loops to the opening line, reframes everything as Ponyboy's attempt to reach someone who has not yet made the same mistakes. The ending does not promise the town will change. It argues that the first real change is a person deciding to see clearly, then speak plainly. The Outsider's summary, why it endures. The Outsiders endures because it treats teenagers as morally serious people living inside real stakes. Hinton does not romanticize poverty or glamorize fights. She shows how quickly a kid can be forced into adult consequences, and how love can exist inside a world that still hurts you. This book is for readers who want emotional clarity, fast pacing, and characters who feel like more than symbols. It is also for anyone who recognizes how often society misreads young people by flattening them into labels. Some readers may not enjoy it if they prefer subtle, slow literary style, because the novel's directness is part of its force. It leaves you with a simple, difficult question: if the world keeps rewarding hardness, can you still choose to stay gold? More insight, less noise. Subscribe and explore the full range at taylortailored.co.uk.